Right, we're revisiting the clothyard shaft. Now, the first thing I'm going to say, well actually it's not, the reason why we're revisiting clothyard shaft is because one of you guys, Andrew Sock, I love that name by the way, posted a comment on below the video where I talked about the clothyard shaft, and you gave your ideas and reasonings and things like that, and I enjoyed reading it, but you've got the wrong end of the stick in a few places from some of the things you wrote. Now I have made a video about like answering and talking about the points you raise already, but it ended up being 2.5 hours long. Because this subject is really close to my heart. The history, the military and social history of archery in England is it's my thing, and it may well, if I can get everything sorted out soon enough, will actually be the subject of my PhD, because I'm considering studying for my doctorate. Right, but that's besides the point. So it's my thing. So anyway, as I said, one of the first things I'll say about the clothyard shaft is that I am not the only person who will tell you this. And the clothyard shaft is different. The clothyard is different to a yard. You were trying to say that it was the same thing. It's not. The whole point that you were making, you've got a little bit confused and a little bit conflated. But anyway, we'll go into that. The first thing you said was that I was wrong about the fact that it was measured from the tip of your nose to the tip of your fingers of an average man. I'm sorry to tell you this, but no, I'm not wrong. But then again, neither are you. We'll come back to that. You see, prior to the reign of Henry I, and specifically, I believe he did it in 1185, 95, anyway, 1180, right? Prior to Henry I, the yard, which is an ancient measurement, which goes all the way back pre-Roman, you can trace the etymology of the word and everything through Old English way back pre-Roman to Celtic and Breton and British and all that sort of stuff. The yard was measured from the tip of your nose to the tip of your outstretched fingers. Now, prior to Henry I, it was probably measured against somebody within your area or your village who was reputable and reliable and who was going to be there all the time. Probably the blacksmith, if your village had a blacksmith. If it had a church, possibly the clergyman. But somebody who was there all the time and who was reliable would be who would set the measurement. Now the measurement is basically based on, in England, it's based on the average person, the average man, from the tip of his nose to the tip of his fingers. Now the average height in England, and it has been like this for a long time, for instance, Henry VIII was 5'10". The average height of somebody in the UK, in England today, is 5'10". Average height hasn't changed. So if you look at Henry I, which is where the King's Yard comes from, which you were talking about, from the tip, right, he was reportedly just over 5'10", which gives him a span from fingertip to fingertip of 71 inches, which gives him a half span from fingertip of nose, from nose to fingertip of 35 and a half inches. So he is going to be somewhere around about 35 to 36 inches from tip of finger to tip of nose. But that didn't come in until 1193, I think, 1193. That was the first time the measurement was standardized, and it was called the King's Yard. So from that point of view, you are correct. It was measured from that point on the King's measurement. Now, the second time, and he didn't just measure, like standardize the yard. He created a lot of standard measurements, including our mile, gallons, pints, instituted weights and measures about how much. He was the first one to say how much bread should weigh, how much it should cost, how much beer and ale should cost, and how much you should get in a pint, which, typical Englishman, got to make sure your beer's sorted. So he set up quite a lot of standardisation in weights and measures. The next time it happened was Henry VII in 1485 or something, with what was called the Winchester measurement, sometimes called the Winchester standards. And again, he standardised, didn't change much from Henry I's measurements. He tweaked things a little bit. For instance, he standardised the yard at 36 inches. Now we know this for a fact because it's specific. Henry I, we don't know exactly how long he made the yard. We just know that he made a standard measurement based on his own body measurements, and that went around the country. We'll come back to that. But we know for a fact that Henry VII set it at 36 inches, along with the pounds and stone in the weight measurements we use. He standardised everything. So, and we know that because it was written down and it was codified as the Winchester measurement. The next time anything was standardised was when it was all came under the banner of the imperial system, which is still used in America today and a few other places around the world. Even here in England, in the UK, we use a weird mixture of metric and imperial. So that's the 3 times that weights and measures have been standardised in England. Now we'll get back to how that applies to cloth. So Henry I, you actually mentioned the fact that you believe that these measurements were marked onto church walls. I can't find any evidence of that before at all. So if you can tell me where that church is that you mentioned, which you said you only knew of one, I'd be really interested because I might be able to use that in my PhD studies. But what I'd have found is that in England, because of the Domesday Book, we know that we had just shy of 2,000 churches at the beginning of the 1100s, 12th century. But from the time of Henry I onwards, which was mid-12th century, he started issuing warrants to what we in England called market towns. These market towns were given a specific license to hold markets on specific days of the week. Mainly because, for instance, in the area I live in, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's 7 market towns in the area I live in. And each one of them is by wagon, is about 2 days apart, 2 or 3 days apart. So they were all given warrants to hold markets on specific days of the week: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then some of the towns were permission to hold an extra market on a Saturday, which was generally a livestock market with other merchants thrown in. But the merchants, there was no such thing as shops really. The merchants would travel from town to town to town, taking their wares on a wagon. Now, each of these market towns were given a copy of the yardstick and the other weights and measures that the king had imposed. And they were expected, and he even set up assizes or courts where where infractions of these standards would be tried and judged. And some of the punishments were quite harsh. Some of them you would actually get beaten with sticks for a mile down a road, things like that. You'd be running anyway. So they're quite well maintained in the market towns. And what you would find in the market town is the inspector of markets, or your local guild master, or your local town clerk would be, and even they do it today in England, would be wandering around the market with his pack of weights and measures and his yardstick, and he would randomly check people for how much stuff they were selling and what weights they were selling and what lengths they were selling. So yes, from that point of view, a yard sold in a market town, a yard of cloth sold in a market town would be 35 or 36 inches long. However, this is where the difference comes in. where the cloth yard comes in. Just like in the baker's dozen, a baker would bake an extra loaf because the price of wheat and things like that would fluctuate, but he wasn't allowed to change the price of bread. So he'd bake a couple of extra by the time he'd baked 12 dozen loaves. Take note of that number, by the way. 12 dozen loaves, a gross of loaves. He would actually have an extra 12, an extra dozen left. They would pay wages, they would pay bribes. There would be his own food for the day. So it was all about maximising profit. Because sometimes prices were fixed and you couldn't change the price. Even if the price of wheat flour went up, or you couldn't change the price to match accordingly. If it went down, so much the better. You could actually make more profit. That's the bread. There was the same thing with cloth and most other things. Now, before we get back onto the cloth and the markets, if the cloth yard and the yard were the same thing, why bother calling it a cloth yard? Now, the yard that went around as part of the weights and measures legislations, the yard was there to be used by everybody. Didn't matter what your trade was, you were expected to use those weights and measures. If you were a carpenter, you would be expected to measure things in yards and feet taken from the king's yard, the king's yardstick. The yardstick would be divided, it would be 36 inches long, and then divided up into 3 equal foot lengths, and each of those would be divided up into 12 equal inch lengths. And you would even have palms on there as well, as I mentioned in the first video. So it wasn't just for cloth, it was for everything. For instance, and again, we'll come back to this, barrel makers. They were expected to use the king's yard as well. For instance, a standard barrel, 24-inch barrel, was expected to have an overall height of 36 inches. Because the way they were made, if you had a 26-inch wide barrel by 36 inches high, they knew exactly there was basically a 200 litre, which is 100 gallons, basically. I can't remember the conversion, but basically it was a known volume of liquid. In today's money, the barrels are still made today with the same internal dimensions to give them a 220 litre capacity, which I can't remember what it is in actual gallons. I think it's nearly 30 gallons or something, whatever. But it was a standard. So the barrels were even made to the standard. A carpenter was expected to measure everything. Now, the church that you mentioned, the only thing I can think of there is that there was no market hall. The market halls were used during the winter with inclement weather. The market halls tended to get used by the cloth merchants, where you didn't want to be selling wet cloth if it was raining outside. Food and veg, it didn't matter so much. Because it didn't matter. It doesn't matter if potatoes get wet. If anything, they get cleaner if they get wet. So it doesn't matter about stuff like that. But the market hall was generally used for selling stuff that you didn't want to get wet, like cloth. So the only thing I can think of is that maybe the church you're talking about that village, that town, didn't have a market hall or a suitable other building. So maybe that building was used as a market hall, which is why the marking would be on the door or the wall or something like that. But again, I'd be interested to know where that church is. So we're getting back to the markets and the cloth yard. Now, where the cloth yard comes in, as in tip of the nut or centre of the chest to the web of the hand, when you were travelling from market town to market town, there was nothing to stop you selling to people you came across on your travels from market town to market town, which might be a 2 or 3 day journey. But you'd quite often stop off for the night in a little village. You might call in the local pub for a bite to eat and a drink, and you'd sell some cloth, or you'd sell some whatever else. If you were a tinker, you'd sell your pots and pans or whatever. You'd sell your goods in those little villages. And how everybody knew at the time that a yard was basically tip of your nose to the end of your arm. So if you went to a cloth merchant, said, give us a yard of wool, and he put it to his chest and did that, most people would be quite happy that they were getting a yard, because all they know is that that's a yard. It might be a little bit short, If the merchant's taller, it might actually be a little bit more. But generally speaking, you are going to get, as far as you're concerned, you're going to get a yard. Now, the fact that most of the time is going to work out from an average height man of 5'10" at 32 inches is besides the point. That's just the way it was. Now, the cloth yard shaft wasn't named that because it was the same length as the yard. It just happens to be the length that they were cut, which matched a cloth yard. It matched that point from the centre of your chest to the web of your hand. And because the two measurements matched, it was called a cloth yard shaft. Now, there are other reasons why, and you did actually ask this question, but you framed it as if the arrows were made shorter, 32 inches rather than 36, because of a shortage of wood. That's not true, but we'll get onto that. But there's another reason why arrow shafts were cut to 32 inches, which I've only just discovered in the day before yesterday when I was trying to make the other video, the full-length video. Arrow shafts, when they're cut to length, they were cut to length because they fit in a barrel, a standard 24-inch barrel, of which the internal dimensions of a standard medieval 24-inch barrel are 22 and a half inches wide diameter and 23 inches from top to bottom. 33 inches from top to bottom. So if you take, and this is what I was on about earlier on, where the yard was used to measure barrels as well. If you go to the top of the barrel, which was, they said it had to be a certain height. If you look at them, they're like an inch thick roughly. The lids are inset into the barrel by about an inch, and the lids are about an inch thick. Same with the base, it's inset by an inch, and it's roughly an inch thick, which gives you an overall diameter inside dimension of 33 inches, give or take. 32-inch shaft drops in. Now here's the thing, arrows by the dozen, 12 dozen arrows is 144, one gross. Guess how many arrow shafts, bare arrow shafts, you can get in a standard medieval 24-inch barrel? You get 12 gross. 12 times 12 times 12. Now I don't think that's a coincidence, do you? So there you go. Now you know why it's 32 inches. You also know why it's called a cloth yard shaft. Right, anyway, I don't think we need to discuss the cloth yard shaft anymore. I'm going to do separate videos covering the other points you made about materials and arrow length and things like that, because I think you are actually conflating draw length with shaft length and arrow length. They are three completely separate measurements, but you seem to think, and you're not the only person either, there's a lot of people out there who seem to think that during the medieval era everybody shot arrows of the same length. And I don't know why they think that, because they don't do it today. Nobody who shoots, not everybody has the same draw length and shoots the same length arrows as everybody else. Like for instance myself, I have a 28-inch natural draw, and with standard arrowheads I shoot a 29-inch arrow. My son, he has his standard draw is 30 inches and he shoots a 31-inch arrow. My daughter shoots, her natural draw length is 26 inches. Sorry, 25 inches, so she shoots a 26-inch arrow. This explains, and we'll get more into this in another video, the arrow groups sizes found on the Mary Rose, which you don't seem to be too impressed by. But again, another video. That's enough for that one. That's the cloth yard shaft. Now, I don't know whether I said at the beginning of this video, but I'm not the only person who will tell you it's a 32-inch shaft either. Lots of people out there will tell you that. Anyway, hope you found that interesting. Hope you found it of use. If you've got any questions, if you think I'm wrong, please tell me why you think I'm wrong, and if you can prove it to me, I will change everything I think. I'm always open to being educated. So please do. If you've got other points to make, please do. This goes to everybody who's watching this, by the way. If you've got something to say, if you think I'm talking a load of rubbish, please tell me. Anyway, enough said. Stay safe, keep slinging your sticks, and we shall talk again soon. Cheers, guys.